지금부터 한 아프리카 재단과 한국국제정치학회 간 양해각서 체결식을 먼저 시작하도록 하겠습니다. Now we will start the MOU signing ceremony between the Korea Africa Foundation and the Korea Association of International Studies. From the CAF side, the Korea Africa Foundation side, Ambassador Young Chae Kim, the president, will sign the MOU, and from the KAI's side, Professor Sang-Yun Ma, the president, will be his partner today. President Kim and President Ma, please sign the MOUs on the table. And please exchange them with each other and sign the MOUs exchanged. Okay, now please exchange them with each other again. And now please hold the MOUs together, looking ahead. Let's give them a big round of applause, please. Thank you. Guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us for these important sessions titled Africa's Role and Importance in the United Nations. I'm Won-Young Kim, Director of the Research and Information Division of the Korea Africa Foundation. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, this session aims to provide valuable insights into Africa's role in the United Nations and its contributions to the emerging multipolar world order. To begin, it is really my honor to invite my boss, Ambassador Young Chae Kim, President of the Korea Africa Foundation, to deliver the welcome message. Please give a big round of applause. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Actually, I didn't prepare the speech, today's speech, but I just welcome all of you for being here today. Today's forum actually was proposed by Korea Association of International Studies. And then we considered what topic should we discuss. And then considering we have valuable members, particularly from Africa, former Foreign Minister David Francis from Sierra Leone came here, and Professor Osage, Director General of the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, is coming here. So we thought that it will be a good topic if we have UN and Africa. So today's topic is Africa's role and importance in the United Nations system. And in addition to that, we have a real UN expert here today. Ambassador Ojun served as ambassador to the United Nations. Before that, he was Deputy Minister for Multilateral Affairs, which means that as a Deputy Minister, he handled the Korean government's policy and then relations in regard to the United Nations. And then he was, of course, Director General for United Nations Department. Actually, Ambassador Ojun is one time my boss. He was ambassador to Singapore. At that time, I was a counselor in charge of political affairs, and from time to time, he explained the system and the mechanism of the United Nations. So I had some insight from him when I was there. Also, I want to just mention regarding Minister David Francis. Whenever I visited Sierra Leone, he gave me a sort of a lecture about the UN and Africa. Sierra Leone is the chair country of CITEM. CITEM is Committee of 10, which is in charge of UN Security Council reforms. So Sierra Leone has been and is the chair of CITEM for many years. So Sierra Leone is well positioned in leading positions regarding UN Security Council reform in the African context. So we have very good panels today, and also we have professors from Seoul National University, Kim Tae-gyun, and then Professor Kim Dong-seok from this institute. And this session will be valuable for us to understand how we have to understand the international system. There are many ways we can understand the international system through politics, real politics, etc. But it is also necessary to look at the international system from a liberal point of view. Today we have this type of session in order to see how we can analyze the international affairs. Having said that, I want to finish by thanking all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for your welcoming message. So finally for me, it is my honor to introduce today's our moderator, Ambassador Oh Jun, who will guide us through today's presentation and discussions. Ambassador Oh is the board chair of the Save the Children Korea and a distinguished diplomat, having served as South Korea's permanent representative to the United Nations and the president of the UN Economic and Social Council. His expertise and the deep understanding of global affairs make him the perfect moderator for this session. So, Ambassador Oh, thank you for being us today. The floor is yours from now. Please give a big hand for him.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Yeah, I'm testing. Thank you. Thank you. This forum is very important, in my opinion. and I'd like to welcome all of you to this forum organized by the Korea Africa Foundation, headed by Ambassador Kim, and also the Korean Association of International Studies. And the weather is a little chilly, but I think probably more chillier for guests from Africa. But I think it's going to warm up as we start our discussion. And you know, as we all know, the topic we are going to deal with in this session is Africa's role and importance of Africa in the United Nations. As introduced, I spent quite a time when I was a Korean diplomat, working around the United Nations, and as it happens, I was a Korean ambassador to the United Nations when we were sitting in the Security Council last time from 2013 to 14, and now we are back in the Security Council. And when I was there, our Security Council membership was second time for us. So right now we are sitting again, so it's third time for us. And of course, the African group, Africa is the largest regional group in the United Nations, consisting of 54 members. So they always have seats, I think 3 seats in the Security Council, even though Africa does not have a permanent member. And when I was there, when South Korea was sitting there for the second time, African colleagues were from Nigeria and Chad, I remember. And right now I understand Sierra Leone is sitting in the council along with South Korea. So very important partners. All African countries are very important partners for Korea. And throughout the history of the United Nations, Africa's role has grown dramatically. I understand in 1945, when the United Nations was established, there were only 4 African member states out of the total 51 regional members. But now the African group is, as I said, is not only the largest in number, but the group is playing critically important role in all issue areas of the United Nations, including peacekeeping, sustainable development, climate action, and the promotion of democracy and human rights, as well as reform of global governance. You know, Ambassador Kim Young-chae introduced the Honorable David John Francis, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sierra Leone, as a leader in C10. C10 is, of course, for reform of the Security Council, and the position of African group on Security Council reform has always been critically important, even though Korea belongs to another group when it comes to Security Council reform. We fully understand each other's position and we respect them. So without further ado, let me start our discussion. We have 2 distinguished speakers from Africa and 2 eminent discussants from Korea. So they are on my left is Honorable Professor David John Francis, former Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the Republic of Sierra Leone. And sitting next to him is Professor Igosa Osagai, Director General of the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. And sitting on my right is Professor Taegyun Kim, president of the Asia-Africa Center and professor at Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University. And sitting next to him is Professor Dong-Seok Kim at the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security, which is here at the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. Okay, then we will have presentations by the two distinguished African speakers. First, I think I understand they will make their presentations probably within half an hour each. I would like to invite Professor David John Francis first. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Do I use the podium? Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Joinia Shimia. It's a pleasure to be here, and let me take this opportunity to thank the Korea Africa Foundation for the invite to participate in this Seoul 7th dialogue on Africa. And as an academic myself, I really feel comfortable in this academic environment because then I can speak freely. And as a former foreign minister, I now have the license to speak freely about the issues that I would have thought twice to speak properly on diplomatically. So today I can be myself in this academic environment. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. My presentation briefly focuses on Sierra Leone in the United Nations Security Council and the lessons for Africa in an emerging multipolar world order. But to be able to understand that, I thought it is important for me to preface this presentation with a look at Africa in the United Nations itself. What are some of the impact and the lessons, and then I will focus on the actual theme of my presentation. But to be able to do so, let me start off with caveats and clarifications. So when we talk about Africa in the United Nations, what do we mean? We are talking about three distinct categories of Africa in the United Nations. Firstly, we are talking about the 54 countries and member states of the United Nations that are mainly preoccupied with their own national strategic interests, albeit being in the United Nations. And sometimes they do not speak with one voice. They do not act consistently on issues that affect Africa because they are constantly looking out for their own interests, national self-interest. And secondly, the second group we are talking about is the Africa group at the United Nations itself. And this constitutes the 54 member states. And these 54 member states often present themselves as a cohesive, unified group, and they sometimes try to articulate a common African position. They sometimes try to be consistent in advocating for issues that affect Africa. But of course, this, as the ambassador rightly stated, this is the largest group. The Africa group is the largest regional bloc at the United Nations, and it constitutes about 28% of UN members. That is 1/3 of the membership of the United Nations international community. So it's a very powerful group itself. And the third group at the United Nations is the Africa group at the United Nations Security Council. They are referred to as the A3. And the A3, these are the rotational 3 countries elected for a 2-term to serve on the UN Security Council to represent Africa. So this is what we mean by Africa at the United Nations, these 3 distinct groups. But what do we say about the history of Africa and the United Nations? Briefly, by the time the United Nations was created in 1945, the majority of African countries were still under colonial rule. So in effect, 90% of them were still under colonial rule, and only 4 countries actually were involved in the creation of the United Nations, and they include Egypt, Liberia, Ethiopia, and South Africa. By the time the Continental Organization, the Organization of African Unity, the OAU was created in 1963, it was 18 years after the creation of the United Nations itself. So what happened then was that these newly independent African states in the 1960s, 29 of them joined the United Nations at the creation of the Organization of African Unity. So it actually means that we have new body of member states who were able to change the dynamics, the political dynamics of the United Nations General Assembly. So briefly, what has been the impact? Since 1945, the African member states have impacted on the United Nations as an organization, as an institution, as a global governance institution, but at the same time, the United Nations has impacted on Africa itself in the whole area of peace, security, human rights, democracy, humanitarian development, climate action, etc., etc. But again, as I stated, when you have this new body of member states joining the United Nations at that time in the 1960s and 1970s, they immediately changed and shifted the balance of power at the UN General Assembly. Because this new body of nations now could speak with one voice, could vote as a bloc. They found themselves as members of UN committees, and they were able to influence the agenda of the UN General Assembly. They could actually promote agenda items that are in the interests of Africa. But that was very good. And these member states, bear in mind, they have been under colonial rule. So for the first time, they were able to exercise their right of sovereign equality and one country, one vote in the United Nations. That was very much important for them. So they started using the United Nations as a platform, as a unifying platform to promote African issues and issues that are interested or pertinent to the development and progress of Africa, especially in the area of decolonization. It was very important at that time. They used this platform for multilateral diplomacy as well. And in particular, the Africa Group even advocated at the 20th session of the UN General Assembly in 1965 so that the Organization of African Unity was granted an observer status in the United Nations. So today, Africa has impacted on the United Nations. Make no mistake about that. Even in terms of the personnel, Africa has been able to produce 2 United Nations Secretaries General, Brutus Ghali of Egypt, Kofi Annan of Ghana, and importantly, 2 female Deputy Secretary Generals, including Aisha Mongero of Tanzania and the current Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed of Nigeria. Africa and African member states at the UN have participated in all the 6 principal organs of the United Nations. So the important point I am making again and stressing here is that Africa has impacted on the United Nations, and the United Nations has impacted on Africa. But again, there is a caveat. If you listen to most of the international media outlets and commentators, they often, and political analysts, they often present the view that Africa is a mere recipient of UN humanitarian development programs, that Africa has not impacted really on the United Nations. In other words, Africa has been at the receiving end. This is a rather negative and stereotypical presentation of Africa. So I actually say, no, this is absolutely wrong. It's a wrong perspective to present. In fact, some of these political analysts say that Africa is only a passive recipient of UN international peacekeeping deployments in Africa's conflict zones and war-torn societies. Yes, that's true, but there is more to it. So I argue that Africa, far from being mere recipients of UN international peacekeeping deployments in African conflict zones and war-torn societies, Africa has been able to turn it around, and Africa has been able to make credible, impressive peacekeeping deployments, participating in UN peacekeeping missions across the globe. We have countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, war-torn countries contributing to UN peacekeeping. And here, let me give two brief examples of how Africa has impacted on the United Nations in the maintenance of its charter mandate. Don't forget, a principal mandate of the United Nations is the maintenance of international peace and security. So I want to look at just two brief examples of how Africa has supported the United Nations to fulfill its charter mandate of the maintenance of international peace and security. And here, let me look at, firstly, the West African Economic and Political Grouping, ECOWAS, and its military security grouping, ECOMOG, peacekeeping, peace enforcement, and UN co-deployment in West Africa. And I'm sure we are familiar with the brutal civil wars in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, in Cote d'Ivoire, and the complex political emergency in Guinea-Bissau, and how this did not receive international attention and intervention of the United Nations itself, partly because most of the Western countries are preoccupied with other issues. At the dawn of the end of the Cold War, Africa was no longer of strategic relevance to the international actors, but most importantly, the United Nations itself was strategically overstretched. It cannot serve as the policeman of the world. It did not have the capacity, it was overburdened to be able to deploy UN peacekeeping in every conflict zone across the globe. So it therefore had to rely on ECOWAS and its peacekeeping and peace enforcement intervention to be able to do that. So with the success of these interventions in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Guinea-Bissau, we saw the emergence of a new peacekeeping paradigm called ECOWAS, ECOMOG, UN co-deployment. And what is important in this deployment is that in these conflict-torn societies, there were no peace to keep. The ceasefires were not often very fragile. So the UN peacekeepers cannot be deployed with the traditional Chapter 6 mandate as neutral interpositionary forces. So they had to go in with a Chapter 7 mandate, peace enforcement, to keep the peace and enforce the peace. So that was very important in terms of, and they were deployed, especially the UN ECOWAS, ECOMOG deployment. They were deployed under Chapter 8 mandate, in particular Article 52 and 53 of the UN Charter, which recognizes the role and contribution of regional organizations in the maintenance of UN peace and in the maintenance of international peace and security. The Charter is very clear that the UN itself cannot do it all. It has to share the burden of international peace and security with other regional organizations. And out of this ECOMOG, ECOWAS, UN co-deployment, we saw the emergence of a new UN peacekeeping paradigm, which is called robust peacekeeping, under the banner of former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. Robust peacekeeping means that even when there's no peace to keep, you can go in and use preponderant military force to enforce the peace and make sure that you bring the warring factions to the negotiating table. The second example I want to use is that of the African Union, peacekeeping and peace support operations. Again, the same model, the conflicts in Somalia, and after the US deployment and the shadow of Somalia, Black Hawk Down, and I'm sure you've seen most of the movie, and the failure of Operation Restore Hope during George Bush Sr. presidency. Nobody wanted to deal with African conflict situations. No Western country wanted to deploy because of the shadow of Somalia. So it therefore fell on the African Union to deploy peacekeeping forces and peace support operations in Somalia. AMISOM was deployed, and of course in Darfur we have AMIS, but of course led to UN African peacekeeping co-deployment, UNAMID deployment. So what are the lessons here, briefly, before I come now to the main focus, that is Sierra Leone? This clearly shows from this exposition that Africa has not been a passive recipient of UN peacekeeping and peace support operation deployment. If anything, Africa has provided peacekeeping contingents for peacekeeping deployments across the globe, and they have also included multidimensional peacekeeping, police and civilians as well. So the ECOWAS peacekeeping and peace support operations clearly shows that with this emerging peacekeeping doctrine, it is important that we now begin to factor in the African dimension. So I have often argued in two of my books, actually. One is co-deployment in 2005, ECOWAS UN co-deployment in 2005, and the other book is Uniting Africa in 2006. I have argued in these two books that the role, that when you talk about the way and manner in which UN is able to maintain international peace and security across the globe, that debate cannot be concluded without a commentary on the role of regional intergovernmental collective security organizations like ECOWAS and ECOMOG, how they have been able to support the UN to fulfill its charter mandate of the maintenance of international peace and security. So, what is also important is that with this realization, the UN itself has now taken on board the experiences learned from African peacekeeping deployment, especially the multidimensional hybrid peacekeeping, and factored it into the UN international peacekeeping operations. So the first time also, the United Nations has accepted and is now incorporating the African philosophy and practice of African solutions to African problems. That is important. For the first time, UN actually recognized that actually we don't have to always tell African nations what to do, or African regional organizations, but African solutions to African problems in the form of ECOWAS, ECOMOG intervention in West Africa, African Union intervention in Somalia, in Darfur, Burundi. These are all very good examples. So now, let me conclude by looking at Sierra Leone in the UN Security Council and the lessons. I don't know how much you know about Sierra Leone itself, but Sierra Leone is a small, relatively small, resource-rich, 7.8 million population. It came to international prominence because of the bloody civil war in the 90s. And that warranted the deployment of the largest UN peacekeeping force ever. At some point, there was 24,000 UN peacekeepers deployed, UNAMSIL, jointly with ECOWAS and ECOMOG. But what is also interesting about Sierra Leone is that Sierra Leone itself has been presented as a successful model of UN peacekeeping, but also of international liberal peace building. And in fact, the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has described Sierra Leone as a success story. And here in my book, I think 2012, I question that, the notion of liberal peace building and Sierra Leone as a success story. and the title of the book is When War Ends. I challenge the notion of liberal peace building and how it is Western-centric, how it is exit strategy orientated. You go in, preponderant military force, you force all the rebel factions to the negotiating table, you don't solve the underlying problems, and then you get out. When things fall apart, then you blame the countries again. So I've been very skeptical, but Ban Ki-moon, then as UN Secretary General, had to present a successful model. So Sierra Leone has been one of them. But Sierra Leone, as a small country with limited political clout, has served on several UN committees, including the Decolonization Committee. Sierra Leone is currently the African Union coordinator, as Ambassador Keane explained, for the reform of the UN Security Council. Sierra Leone has also been able to transform its battered global image from being a representation of the hopeless continent with bloody civil wars to one that is now a provider of UN peacekeeping forces in Somalia, in Haiti, in other parts of the world. So, Sierra Leone is currently in the UN Security Council for the tenure 2024-2025. And let me look at the final section to see. Sierra Leone, this is not the first time Sierra Leone has been in the Security Council. The first time that Sierra Leone, this small, relatively underdeveloped country, has been in the Security Council, first time in 1970-71. And during that time, Sierra Leone did something that was unique. Sierra Leone, together with the 26 other member states, championed the UN Resolution 2758. What is important about this resolution? This is the resolution that officially recognized the People's Republic of China as the sole and legitimate state to represent China at the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council. So Resolution 2758, championed by Sierra Leone, also recognized the international principle of the One China policy. In fact, it was Chairman Mao Zedong during that time who said, it was our African friends that brought us back to the United Nations. So out of this, Sierra Leone creating this leadership to champion Resolution 2758 at the UN General Assembly and the One China policy has led to very strong bilateral relationship between Sierra Leone, a country of 7.8 million with a GDP of 4 billion, and that of a leading superpower, China, a population of 1.4 billion with a GDP of 17 trillion, and it has led to significant development assistance and infrastructural diplomacy support to Sierra Leone because of this. So, today, Sierra Leone is at the UN Security Council. And my task as foreign minister last year, for the past 3 years, was really to take Sierra Leone back to the United Nations Security Council. So on the 6th of June 2023, Sierra Leone was elected to the UN Security Council with one of the highest votes ever, 188 votes. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, but let me tell you, the road to the UN Security Council seat was not an easy one. It was tough, it was difficult, it was challenging for one simple reason, because we went against Nigeria. And there is a saying in West Africa, in all the political, you don't go against Nigeria. Simply, Nigeria is the most important, populous, militarily, economically powerful state in West Africa. So I did the unthinkable as foreign minister. I went against Nigeria. Well, of course, I knew the weakness of Nigeria. As foreign minister, I knew if you have access to the president, you have a lot of things settled. So obviously, through short diplomacy, we were able to go and meet with. I convinced my president, and we booked an appointment. And President Buhari sent his own private executive jet to take us from Sierra Leone. Imagine we are coming to beg him. He sends his own plane to come and beg him. That shows the solidarity and support. So we were able to secure the ECOWAS endorsement and the African Union endorsement. And we were able to use the political solidarity of a small state, because we said to Nigeria, look, we have supported you to be in the UN Security Council 5 times now. Why don't you give it to small Sierra Leone? When we are there, we will cater for your interests. So they understood that politics. So they agreed to get Nigeria to magnanimously stand down. And I still remember at the African Union Council of Foreign Ministers, I did not sleep for 2 nights because I had to make sure I get all the support of all the member states, because Nigeria, you know, when Nigeria talks, everybody listens. Sierra Leone, when we talk, probably half of the room will listen. So fortunately, I had a very good friendship with the foreign minister of Nigeria. I had very good friendship with the foreign minister and deputy prime minister of Ethiopia. And I had very good friendship, personal friendship and political trust with Musa Faki, the AU Commission. So that combination was very important. But then securing the endorsement was only one thing. That was only the beginning. The second aspect was, we are a poor nation. We cannot even finance our own campaign because it's expensive in terms of the short to diplomacy, the travels around the globe to secure the vote, etc. I remember the Nigerian foreign minister, when we met, he said, please don't ask me for money. We have given you the endorsement, so don't come to us again for money for your campaign. We did actually, and they were generous enough to provide us. But what we learned in that process, I'm spending time to talk about the politics of going to the Security Council because it's very complex, and I'm sure South Korea doesn't have that kind of problem in terms of the financial resources and leverage, because South Korea is a global pivotal state, relatively small, but very powerful in terms of its economic might and its political leverage and outreach. What is important also, we were able to use a unique strategy of securing financial support and leverage from our non-Western partners. Because when I approach our Western partners, they all refuse, including South Korea, to give even 1 penny or 1 material. Ambassador Kim was very generous in terms of helping us to secure the vote. But it is not just the vote, it is the campaign materials, etc. But what I realized, the moment we were voted in on the 6th of June last year, the next day, my phone was clogged up with all the ambassadors from the UK, United States, the EU, all of them wanting to talk to us, to support us and provide resources and personnel. You know that word, personnel means, some people will say spies, so that they come and support you as you go into the security. I did say I'm speaking as an academic. I'm not speaking as foreign minister, so I have the freedom to say. So I was surprised. Here, the Western partners were not prepared to support us. But suddenly we are there. They have to support us because they know that when you are at the Security Council, you can promote their strategic interests. So what are the lessons here in all of this? Today, Sierra Leone and Africa at the United Nations are faced with an emerging multipolar world order. And this multipolar world order is dominated by the emergence of the global South, led by China and Russia, as manifested by the geopolitics and geoeconomics of the BRICS group. What is more, the wars in Ukraine and Gaza and Lebanon have clearly shown to the African nations and the Africa group at the UN, it has demonstrated what is being perceived as double standard of the West and Western alliance, when it comes to respect for rule-based world order, respect for international law, respect for laws relating to war crimes, genocide, and the enforcement of UN resolutions. So, because of the reality of this emerging multipolar world order and the perception of this Western double standard, African nations and the Africa group at the UN are no longer willing to blindly follow the demands and narratives of the dominant Western-centric world order led by America and its allies. There's a shift now. I've seen it clearly during the campaign for the Security Council. It was so clearly obvious to us that the world is polarized. It's so polarized. And that is why in the Ukraine-Russian war, only 51% of African nations voted in favor of the UN resolution to condemn Russia. In fact, recently, only 43 African nations voted in favor of the UN General Assembly resolution recognizing Palestinian statehood and the end of Israel's occupation in Palestine. So what I'm saying here is that with the support of Africa, the UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly in favor of Palestine's bid to become a member of the United Nations. So distinguished ladies and gentlemen, these examples illustrate that Africa is now using its numerical strength, its voting power, to shift the global balance of power that has been dominated by the West, in particular by the United States at the United Nations. Africa is no longer a passive observer. Africa is no longer a mere object of international affairs at the UN. The South African case, which led to the ICJ, the UN International Court of Justice, that brought against Israel on allegations of genocide and war crimes in Gaza, is a powerful example of how Africa is positively influencing rule-based international system. So Africa is now pulling its weight at the United Nations and the UN Security Council as a relevant actor in this emerging multipolar world order. So finally, and in conclusion, what about the lessons of Sierra Leone at the UN Security Council? Sierra Leone came to the UN Security Council for the tenure 2024-2025 on the theme of support for multilateralism and partnership, because the actual brutal civil war in Sierra Leone was only ended because of the UN international community's use of multilateralism and partnership. So Sierra Leone represents a success story to some extent of the relevance of UN multilateralism and partnership approach to maintain international peace and security. So during this second term, Sierra Leone came to the United Nations to bring two messages. One, the message of resilience, in the sense that despite the decade-long brutal civil war, the war has been ended. Sierra Leone is back on its feet. It shows that Sierra Leone is a resilient nation and a resilient people. And second, that out of this resilience is the message of hope. The message of hope is that war-torn countries can end brutal civil wars. They can build peace, reconstruct failed and collapsed states, and reconcile bitterly divided communities. So this is the message from Sierra Leone's experience. And the message is that it can be done. From Ukraine to Gaza, to Lebanon, to Iraq, to Afghanistan, to Libya, to Yemen, to Sudan, to Syria, the message of hope is that it can be done. And on that note, I thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Minister Francis, for giving us a very excellent rundown on the history of Africa in the United Nations, as well as the current activities and current issues, faced by African countries and the contribution made by African countries to the United Nations. I'm particularly impressed by your role as a foreign minister in bringing Sierra Leone back to the Security Council last year. And to help the understanding of the audience, among 193 UN member states, about 1/3 of them has never sit on the Security Council. Getting Security Council non-permanent seat is very difficult. And in Asia, Japan and India and Pakistan, followed by South Korea, are the countries that are coming back to Security Council most often. In Africa, I think Nigeria and South Africa, Africans, non-permanent members in the Security Council. So, for Sierra Leone, coming back to the Security Council for a second time is a great achievement. And I think you deserve appreciation of your government and people for that. And I don't know if you understand this term, clean slate. Clean slate means if a certain region has 2 seats, if there are 2 candidates, it's clean slate. 2 seats, 2 candidates. So you don't have to fight no more, right? But in United Nations, Asian group and Western European group never have clean slates. You always have to fight. You always have to compete. So the fact that Sierra Leone came back to the Security Council last year against Nigeria also shows the strength of the African group as a coordinator for elections. Asian group never coordinate for elections. Western European group coordinate for policies. So Western Europe always comes up with a single position on policy issues, but they never coordinate election. So coordinating election is more difficult because they have to, big countries don't want to make compromise, They don't want to give way. So small countries don't usually have chance. But in African group, when I was ambassador and when I was deputy ambassador as well, I was always amazed by how the African group is always able to coordinate and come up with clean slates. Anyway, that's a very interesting presentation by Minister Francis. And now I would like to invite Professor Osage, Director General of the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. Let me say how very delighted I am to be here in Seoul, in South Korea. Let me start on a note of gratitude. First is to say that our good friend, Yongchai Kim, who is the immediate past ambassador of Korea to Nigeria, has built things in Nigeria that would last for a lifetime. He has left his footsteps on the sands of time across history. At the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, today we have a conference chamber that has been remodeled and upgraded by the good people and government of Korea through his singular efforts. And at the Foreign Service Academy of Nigeria, you'd also find the imprint of South Korea. Now, we can never be fully grateful, but as a country, we let Ambassador Kim know how very grateful we are by making him an honorary chief in Nigeria, and also conferring on him an honorary doctorate of the Western Delta University in Nigeria. So thank you, Ambassador Kim. The second point, just before I go into my presentation, is to elaborate a little bit more on what His Excellency, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Sierra Leone and our chairman have alluded to. Now, Professor has talked about Nigeria's, how would we say, Nigeria's support for Sierra Leone, even at the time that Nigeria was competing with Sierra Leone for the same seat. It tells you about the African value, of the moral burden of leadership. For us in Africa, leadership and power would never mean, that you use the resources that you have to dominate other people. It means simply that you are your brother's keeper, and just because you have the resources, you have a moral responsibility to ensure that the interests of those that don't have what you have are protected. So you would see that part of the success that Africa has recorded in the United Nations is because of the morally driven platforms that Africa has introduced to the world in terms of the value of consensus building that underlies coalitions and coalition building. That's something that the world has had to learn from Africa's diplomacy, which is part of Africa's rich political culture and heritage. But today I want to talk about Africa's role, its very critical and strategic roles in the United Nations, in terms of the continuities and the changes that have happened across time. What I'm going to do first is to go along the lines of the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sierra Leone by underpinning the centrality of the United Nations to Africa's construction and perception of itself, and Africa's emergence as a formidable force, and use that as a basis for analyzing the strategic and critical roles that Africa has played across different phases of time. Now first, yesterday we were at the 7th dialogue, and we spent quite some time looking at the meaning of Africa. Today, the Honorable Minister has said that Africa can be understood within the context of the United Nations in three different ways. And he's talked about one being Africa of 54 countries, Africa, of the group in the General Assembly, and Africa as the A3 in the Security Council. Now, all of these three are complementary, and they reinforce, the Africa's image, character, and role in the United Nations. But still, people have difficulty in following what exactly Africa can mean. For many people, Africa is just another country. I mean, it's one country. I mean, to say that you have the Korea-Africa Summit, as we said yesterday, is to presuppose that Africa is one. Or to have the summit that Turkey has with Africa, or Italy, or China, or the United States. The assumption for many people is that Africa is one. Now, nothing can be more inaccurate, because the reality is that Africa is not one country. Africa is a continent of such great diversity that even in climatic conditions, many people would have to understand that Africa begins from the desert regions to the dense forests and to the mangrove swamps. So Africa climatically is very diverse. Africa has 54 sovereign nations. Now that's quite huge, and we've been told that that's the single most dominant constituency in the United Nations. But Africa also has diverse cultures, and languages, and religions, and so on. That in fact, there are those who say that Africa is so seriously fragmented that it will be a myth to say there is such a thing as Africa. Today, there is the geopolitical distinction often drawn between Africa south of the Sahara and North Africa. The assumption is that, North Africa and Africa south of the Sahara, even in terms of the development differentials, don't quite belong together. Okay? Over and above all of this, of course, we have an Africa that has several regional groups, the ECOWAS, the East African Community, the Southern African Development Community, SADC, and so on and so on. All of these suggest that Africa is really diverse, and that we must keep that in mind when we talk about Africa. But that's not where the story ends. Because when I look at my brother from Sierra Leone, and he looks at me, he and I know that we belong together. We are Africans. Now, this was a theme taken up in 1963 by a distinguished African social theorist called Ali Mazrui. Ali Mazrui in 1963 wrote a very, very critical article in the American Political Science Review that year entitled "On the Concept We Are All Africans." And his primary question was, how true is it that we are all really Africans? And can we say that there is content and context, to that definition? I was simply responding to the earlier writings by the great Africanist, Professor Herskovits, who in 1960 had said that Africa is a geographical accident. It's a geographical expression. It doesn't suggest that there's a community of interests or that the people are bound together by common interests. Now, Ali Mazrui takes this theme up and he says, the truth is that nearly all of the 54 countries in Africa today have artificial origins. In other words, they were colonial creations. Now, if you look at Africa and contrast Africa with, say, Asia, you would ask the question, why was Asia not an alternative term for India, for instance? Now, he says it couldn't have been because India itself was a country, a civilization that had existed and become a point of reference before Asia as a geopolitical reference point became critical. Now, you cannot say the same for the countries that make up Africa. Only a few of them, principally Ethiopia and maybe Egypt. But all of the other countries, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, and so on, are colonial creations. And therefore, there was a problem trying to put the things together to say we're African. And I'm happy to tell you that in terms of the constructivist perspectives of how identities are created and consolidated, the UN became a strong platform for constructing a cohesive African identity and consolidating it. So Ali Mazrui didn't recognize that factor, but today I'd like to suggest to you that the UN provided the crucible for the consolidation of an African collectivity. Now, in 1963, of course, the Organization of African Unity was founded. Now, that came after the establishment of the UN in 1945. And as we've been told, there were 4 countries from Africa that were foundation members of the UN. But they were not, in the real sense of it, African in that sense. You know, they just belonged to a world that had emerged from the Second World War and wanted peace and so on. And Ethiopia, of course, you know, had a moral burden of leadership, as I've said, about African leadership, and therefore, you know, was able to articulate the points about decolonization and the right to self-determination and how racial, you know, problems should be dealt with generally. But the African community of interests hadn't crystallized at that early stage. Now, it was only after 1963 when 29 countries and more became members of the UN that the African identity and its political unity and unification started to come together. And I would say that in terms of the conceptual frame for this analysis, it is best to consider that having come of age, in other words, having crystallized as the African front in the UN, how did Africa then relate to the UN? And I've used the notions, the historical notions of continuity and change as the basis for doing this. Now, in terms of continuity, Africa is a product of its colonial past. And therefore, there are many things that are crucial to Africa. The first is that African countries found the UN as a platform for safeguarding and protecting their hard-won independence and sovereignty. Think of it, in a world of real politics where, you know, the power is might, you require a multilateral organization like the UN that is committed to a rules-based global system to protect weaker and smaller countries. And so the UN, Africa quickly embraced because this was the best way to protect its sovereignty. And that has never been lost on the African factor in the UN. That, you know, whatever you may say about superpower politics and so on, at the end of it all, there is a rule-based system, you know, that can keep at bay, at least in theory, the kinds of superpower, you know, domination and so on that superpower politics would encourage. So that's key. But Africa also then quickly said the whole of Africa would not have meaning until the last vestiges of colonialism and colonization had been taken out of the continent. And therefore, one of the most important roles that Africa has always played from that time is decolonization role and the liberation of Africa. It's not, you know, by accident that Africa spearheaded the constitution of a special committee on apartheid in the UN, and that committee had the virtual monopoly of African chairs, you know, who did that until South Africa got liberated in 1994. So Africa has that strictly at the back of its mind. Now, a quick extension of that was to, in the context of the Cold War, quickly accept, you know, that the greatest threat to Africa's emergence as a country, as, you know, a collectivity, would be getting drawn one way or the other into the very zero-sum politics of the Cold War. And so Africa maintained, along with other parts of the world, what was a middle-of-the-road, trajectory in terms of non-alignment. And therefore, that became a critical bloc, a non-aligned bloc in the UN in the days of the Cold War. And through that, Africa was able to pursue its objectives by insisting that positive neutrality, the kinds of principles that would make you say, we want to have self-determined positions on global affairs, was the way to go. The second thing, of course, was immediately after independence, it was obvious that because of the artificial origins and the colonial acts of creation that brought many of these countries into being, national cohesion and integration was always going to be a big issue. And so Africa was, in the UN, in the forefront of those earliest efforts to keep these new countries together. And so Nigeria, Ethiopia, and many of these countries, quickly embraced the peacekeeping mandate of the UN. And you would find that next to India and Pakistan, countries in Africa, but especially in Nigeria, have been, such great partners of the UN peacekeeping operations and so on. For that reason, when a peacekeeping operations unit was set up, the first, head of that unit was a Nigerian, in the UN. So peacekeeping operations, state building, and those kinds of interventions that went just beyond humanitarian interventions to ensure that states were kept together, were very key to Africa's initial and continuing interests, because the African states have different levels of fragility. And if states are fragile, they need to survive and to be held together. So those remain, continuous, platforms for understanding Africa's critical roles in the United Nations. Now, but once that was over, in other words, once independence came to the whole of Africa after 1994, when South Africa joined the role of independent countries, the liberated countries, the challenges of development, then became the next, preoccupation of the African states in the UN. And yesterday we were told that Agenda 2063 of the African Union was, some kind of forerunner to the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals that replaced the Millennium Development Goals. Now, if you look at Africa's objective conditions today, one of the definitions that many people have, or characterizations of Africa, is extreme poverty and relative underdevelopment. So when people think of Africa, they think of a very poor continent, a continent of poor people, a continent of conflict, a continent of, hunger, a continent of food insecurity, and so on and so on, a continent of very poor infrastructural development, a continent of poor governance, all of the things that would mean the challenges, multi-dimensional challenges of development. And so African countries started to say, now that we have become independent and decolonization has been pursued to a logical point where we now have the foundation for actually addressing the more fundamental issues of state fragility, it is time to begin to tune the UN to addressing critical issues of development. So if you look at the emergence of human security, as a hold-all concept for approaching issues of development as the underbelly, as the concomitant variable for ensuring not just national integration and state survival, but also development. You would see the African imprint, in all of these things. So the Sustainable Development Goals today are things that the African countries have pushed the UN to adopt in a manner of the changing progression of Africa. Post-Cold War, there was relative peace, and therefore this was the time to begin to address those kinds of issues. But as you know, Africa became a hotbed of conflicts, and therefore you needed to have new models and new approaches to dealing with development in the midst of insecurity and conflict. And that's where Africa is today, pushing the agenda, for all of these things. So, as he said, there's peace enforcement. There is also state rebuilding, that has come as an integral part of that peace process, that Africa, has put on the agenda in the United Nations. But once these multidimensional engagements came to the fore, then the limitations and weaknesses of the multilateral system built around the UN started to come to the fore. So suddenly, for instance, you would find that there's a conflict in Somalia, and there's a conflict in the Sudan, and there's a conflict in Nigeria, in Sierra Leone, and in Liberia, and these things tend to be neglected. Now, so first, it was that Africans then had to seek their own solutions in accordance with Article 8 of the UN Charter that recognizes the complementarity of regional organizations to the pursuit of global peace and security. And we've talked about ECOMOG and ECOWAS and AU and the standing forces and the kinds of things that Africans had to do on their own. Now, but that was only on the political domain. In the more economic and more fundamental domains, the huge debt burdens, that African countries started to experience led to the realization that the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, were just not in a position to, rise to the challenges and respond adequately to the kinds of challenges of development that African countries faced. Now, but of course, you will know that the UN itself had, through the UNDP, through UNESCO, and so on, those kinds of agencies, had, platforms that African countries could embrace. But even these ones were now only necessary but not sufficient, for the kinds of demands and challenges that Africa had to face. Now, in the midst of all of this, of course, there was the movement towards a unipolar world, one that, was very oppressive, with its insistence on the principles of regime change, for instance. That the whole world had to move along the lines of neoliberal orthodoxy, and that we all had to become one giant political economy. And as the UN itself, became a kind of, conduit for some of these forces that were at play, you had these limitations leading to very critical responses. Fragmentation became even more inevitable, and alternative and optional platforms had to be created. Let me say that a long time ago in Nigeria, at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, in the 1970s and 1980s, we had the idea of the concert of medium powers. Now, the concert of medium powers was a theoretical position that the Institute, proposed as one of the options to an increasingly marginalizing world, to say that if these countries, wanted to be relevant they had to look for platforms and blocks that would be for medium powers and for small powers. So a long time ago was when, the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs thought of groupings like today's BRICS. So what bodies like BRICS are doing is to say that you can create some alternatives and options, to the UN and the other major multilateral institutions that are capable of responding fairly differently, to the kinds of global issues that are emerging and that are further marginalizing these countries. Think of climate change. Think of artificial intelligence. Think of the debt overhang. Think of, the increase in poverty and the realization that the SDGs are becoming a bridge too far. So it is a time to say, how do we reconfigure the global architecture of governance, to make it fully prepared for a new phase? So today, some talk about reforms of the UN. Now, this is where it's coming from. Because it has become very obvious to everyone that if the UN doesn't democratize, for instance, to put away the Western-centric, trajectories of the organization that was founded on the basis of the interests of the winners of the Second World War. If we don't, look for ways of bringing in the interests of those who joined after the victors, had formed a United Nations multilateral system, we cannot go as far as we would want to. So today, Africa is in the forefront of the push for the UN to be reformed. And one of the pillars, for this push is the demand for African representation, increased representation, and not just symbolic representation, but effective representation in the UN Security Council. And so Africa is saying that we need at least 2 seats in the Security Council. And the Zulwini consensus that the Africans reached said those 2 representatives that will sit on the Security Council would have to be chosen by Africans themselves, using our coalition blocks. This is where we are with the UN today, but let me just conclude by saying that Africa has come of age. This actually is the title of a historical address by the Nigerian head of state in the meeting of the Organization of African Unity in January 1976, where he was saying that Africa would refuse to be led by the nose, that Africa has its own ability to make its choices, self-determined choices, and that Africa should be allowed, to do the things that it is able to do. So Africa has something to show the world in terms of how to meet the goals and the mandate of the United Nations. If we're going to be able to turn our swords into plowshares, if we're going to be able to pursue the common good of all globally, if we're going to have shared prosperity for the future, we should build coalitions. We should build consensus. We should be guided by the moral responsibilities that suggest that you are not powerful only because you can dominate. You are powerful only because you can take care of the less privileged. And you are stronger when all groups are strong. So the summary of Africa's drive today is for global justice using the platform of the UN. That is the position where Africa is today with regard to the UN reforms. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Osage. That was an excellent presentation, and thank you for sharing with us your insights on African identity and also Africa's role in global governance these days. You know, your description of the United Nations as a platform for the consolidation of African unity, African identity is very fresh to me, and it's a very excellent way of, you know, considering the role of the United Nations as well. Now we have two distinguished discussants, and I suggest within 15 minutes each, and I would like to give floor to Professor Dong-Seok Kim first.
I'd like to thank Your Excellency Francis and Osage for delivering these wonderful and insightful presentations. So, I think 5 months before the Korea-Africa Summit, in January this year, Italy hosted Italy-Africa Summit. Italian Prime Minister promised to provide huge amount of aid to African countries. AU Chairperson, Excellency Moussa Faki, told, "Thank you very much, but we are not beggars." Through this message, Excellency Moussa Faki ask the European countries not to neglect, not to disparage, not to treat African countries in a condescending manner. So, this remark demonstrates the rising influence of Africa, which resulted in Africa's confidence. Africa is in the middle of realizing political, economic, or social potentials. So, as the Excellency Francis and Osage remarked, Africa has contributed a lot to UN peacekeeping efforts. Africa also is endeavoring to resolve their own conflicts and install peace. So, Africa is a model of conflict resolution and peace building. So, like a Western, scholars or experts or policy makers, right, treat Africans as an object which they teach. So when they offer aid, they impose lots of conditions, especially Western countries, lots of conditions on Africans. Dictate they should do that. You shouldn't do this way, that way. You should do it, right? But Africa, we need to learn a lot from Africa. Right? Africa offers a model of especially peacekeeping, building peace, resolving conflict, overcoming adversities engendered by conflict. Okay. And considering the growing influence of Africa, and considering that 70–80% of UN Security Council agenda pertains to Africa or the Middle East. Africa deserves more representation in the UN and UN Security Council. So, few months ago, recently, United States advocated the idea of two permanent member seats for Africa. But here is the catch: without veto powers. So permanent Security Council seat without veto powers. A lot of experts, Africans, consider this as an insult. Right? And enraged by these suggestions. So, Africa needs to have seat with veto power equally in the UN Security Council. And in order to achieve that goal, African countries and institutions need to convince P5, United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China to accept this idea. It will not be easy, but yeah, because UN Security Council is dominated by these 5 countries. Yeah. So the African countries should exert strenuous efforts to convince these countries. And what if African countries secure seat in the UN Security Council? The question will go to which country will fill the seat? Which country will occupy the seat? Is it South Africa or Nigeria or Ethiopia? Africa consists of 54 countries. Among the 54 countries, several countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Morocco, or Kenya, Ethiopia, etc., wield significant influence on the continent. So, who will occupy the seat? So I think that Africa is very good at consensus building. So to decide which countries will fill the seat, African countries need to endeavor to build some consensus. So I think that Korean government can contribute more to African countries' efforts to resolve conflict, build peace, and to solve their own problems. The 2024 recent Korea-Africa Summit declared that Korean government will increase its contribution to build peace and help African countries build peace and resolve conflict. So I think that now, after the conference is over, the Korean government need to mull over how to contribute more to resolving, diffusing conflict and install peace in African countries. And in order to do that, of course, Korea also need to galvanize communication, right? Communication with African countries. So through by increasing people-to-people exchange, not just high-ranking officials, but also, artists, experts, and others, and enhancing understanding of Africa, catch what African people want, leaders want. Okay, time is up, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim Dong-seok, for sharing your thoughts with us. And last but not least, of course, Professor Tae-gyun Kim from Seoul National University. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you so much. I just learned a lot from the two distinguished speakers from Africa. Actually, the Professor Kim is like expert on the UN, especially in the context of Africa. So he just talked about the many things, many points, very valuable points about the reform to action from the perspective of Africa, especially with the case of UN Security Council. So my point is quite a little bit comprehensive and general kind of purview of African performances in the global governance. So if you look at the history of Africa or the global South or the third world, I think right after the Second World War, and also through the Bandung Conference back in 1955. So we had like G77 is a part of the UN kind of the gathering. Consisting of Africa, the Asia and Latin America. So the 77 different countries at the time, in 1964, formed the name of the Group of 77. And that they very, very, work hard and proactive work against like some Western dominate kind of, the global governance at the time. So they made a kind of UNCTAD in the same year, and also they just continue to, collaborate with each other to set up the new international economic order in the 1970s, even though that kind of proposal is failed. So my point is already the two professors talk about the UN could be defined as platform for constructing or the consolidating Africa in a political unity and the identity and so on. So but my question is quite a little bit different. So I'm wondering, because Africa is now the part of the G20 and the part of the BRICS Plus, the part of the South Summit, and this year, at the very early, January, the Uganda, Kampala, the Uganda is host country of the South Summit. That's kind of the G770 summit. Talk about many things, the 10 different agenda. all of which like related to something how to change the architecture of global governance from the very traditional pattern of the Western dominate system. So my question is the first question: what is the UN function in that the multiple platforms the Africa is now trying to utilize? So beyond like the UN system. So for example, the G20 and the BRICS Plus and so some summits. So what kind of the positioning of the African countries to link, the UN system as well as the non-UN platforms? So what kind of strategies, what kind of perspective the African countries have? So that's my first question. And second, already both speakers talk about the emerging multipolar world order and then the little bit like some of the critics against the liberal international order, like so designed and implemented and still, by the Western power. So rule-based. So you can have the many different names about the liberal international order of the Western power, and versus like emerging multipolar world order. So the global South versus global West. That's a John Eikenberry kind of distinction. So global West and global South can be linked inside the United Nations system. So if we can just link, we can just make some kind of platform for all the public sphere where, global West and global the South discuss something about what kind of the consensus to change the current system. In that sense, what kind of role Africa can take? So what kind of play they can play? So that's the second big question, because the already talk about, we just discussed multipolar world order has been dominated by the global South, the rise of global South, also led by China, Russia, and also BRICS groups. And on the other hand, still we have the living under the liberal international order, even though that is now diminishing, like U.S.-China strategic rivalry and the Ukraine war and the Gaza conflict. So there are many different places they are suffering from the lack of governance. So in that sense, the Western-dominated architecture of global governance should be changed. In what form? So what kind of the perspective African Union and African country have regarding the next step of changing mechanism for Western-dominated architecture, because the next year Donald Trump comes to power, right, in January, so things will change dramatically, I guess. So according to the project 2025 that's published by the Heritage Foundation, and then the Trump administration just received that as the presidential transition project. So though there are many different points they just suggested. 2 points is kind of the warning to global governance. The first one, multilateralism. So could be diminished by the Donald Trump, the second administration. So they don't have any kind of idea and also interest in multilateralism compared to the Joe Biden administration. So multilateralism could be weakened, and then who will fill the gap? Probably the Global South, probably the African Union, African countries. So this is another round of competition inside the United Nations. So I would like to take the SDG. So the end of 2030, that's the last year of the SDG. And then the international community should be talk about what could be the alternative, right? The goals for the humankind right after the 2030. So, but there's no any serious input from the US side, and probably EU, I don't know, maybe EU try to engage very proactively. What kind of the policy strategies of South Korea to deal with the post-SDG era, and how we can collaborate with the African countries or other global South. So that's the second question. Lastly, very, very quick question. What kind of role of South Korea, African country expect South Korea to play what within the United Nations? So already the Professor Kim talked about a bit maybe we can just support like dialogue inside or out, all the, through or in Africa. But more concretely, what kind of the function African leaders are now expecting South Korea to do? So maybe we had many things. We just, if you look at the modernization process, we had the colonial experiences by the Japanese rule, and the Korean War, and economic growth, and the democratization, and finance crisis, and now we are kind of another kind of crisis. But it's kind of a full package of the modern state building. So I think the Global South or the Africa try to learn something about the South Korean way. It's very condensed the developmental state pattern. So in that sense, Africa tried to do like some of the linking South Korea with the African context for the development model. So all in all, so my three big questions is the first one, what is the Africa kind of the perception or the perspective in order to link the G77 or the part of the UN system with the non-UN kind of platforms, the G20, BRICS Plus, and the South Summit. And second question is the emerging multipolar world order versus the liberal international order. So what kind of the idea, if African leaders have, what is the next step, next round of our global governance? How we can reform, so how we can deal with the second Trump administration, particularly SDG, post-SDG kind of the issues. And finally, the what kind of function South Korea, the African leaders now expect. So that's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. When I invite the speakers to speak, at the end of today's forum, I would appreciate it if they can also include answers to the three questions raised by Professor Kim. But before that, I would like to open the floor so that members of the audience can make comments or ask questions. I understand there is a translation interpreter here, so you can feel free to ask questions either in English or in Korean, please. Somebody break the ice. Ambassador Kim. Ambassador Kim is very impatient, so he cannot wait until someone breaking the ice.
I was frequently told that when we talk about the UN, we say half full, half empty. But when we look at the UN history, Korea and Africa have received a lot of help in various ways. So even if the UN system is not working very well, I think we still need to have UN as it is. And then with regard to UN Security Council reform, like we mentioned, Africa need to have two permanent seats with veto power. And we have to think again with that wisdom, in my personal view. Why is the current UN system not working? I think it's simply due to veto system. But at the same time, thanks to veto system, we have not encountered major wars among superpowers. So veto power, in my personal view, has dual faces. But if we add veto powers more, I think it will make the international system more difficult. I would like to listen your views regarding my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kim. Oh, by the way, earlier Professor Dong-Seok Kim expressed support for the Africa's position on Security Council reform, like getting 2 permanent seats. But I think it's his personal support. South Korea's official position is a little different. South Korea, as you know, South Korea belongs to a group of countries that believe non-permanent membership, permanent membership should not be increased at all. That's South Korea's official position. Any questions or comments from the audience? I will get maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then we will go back to the speakers. Yep, over there.
I really appreciate for the great presentations and great discussion. I'm a student, undergraduate student studying international studies in Hankuk University, and also I'm working as a student internship in Korean Africa Foundation. I really enjoyed the presentations and discussion again. Thank you very much. And my question is, there was a lot of mention about the possible, in the future, possible permanent seat of African countries, the 2 seats for African permanent seat. My question is, on which process or which criteria do you think those African permanent seat could be decided, such as rotations or other criteria? Do you think there is a possible consensus or way to reach the consensus? That was my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any lady in the room might have a question. To show that Korean ladies are also interested in African issues. Yep.
Thank you very much for your presentations today. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Tokyo, and I'm studying on Ugandan case as a peace building case. But I have a general question for 2 presenters. Yes, I'm totally agree with the African way to solve African problems. But as you told during the presentation, Africa is a very big continent, and including 54 countries. And they have their own cultures, and there are many difficulties, north to south and east to west. So I think it can be a big challenge to organize a big African Union. So is there any effort to solve the compromise the differences and culture within your organizations? So if there is anything, I want to hear about that.
So in a way, how to overcome diversity within Africa. So if I may sum up the 6 questions actually, 3 posed by Professor Kim Tae-gyun and 3 posed by the audience, including Ambassador Kim Young-chae. For the convenience of speakers, I might as well sum them up. The first question by Professor Kim was Africa's position on the so-called informal multilateral regimes, sometimes called non-United Nations multilateral regimes, like G7, G20, APEC, ASEM. You know, there are multilateral regimes outside the UN system. So in the UN, it is often called informal processes. So what is Africa's position? Obviously, Africa is not participating too many of them. And the second question from Professor Kim is, you know, in the reform of global governance which is dominated by Western countries, we will probably see change in global governance, not least because of new U.S. president. So what is African view on reform of global governance? And third question from him was, what do African countries expect South Korea to do in terms of its relation with Africa? And we have a couple of questions about Security Council reform, and Africa's position on Security Council reform is of course known as Azrweni principle. Azrweni principle requires 2 permanent seats for Africa with veto power, but obviously Ambassador Kim pointed that out. You know, if you insist on veto power, you know, is it in line with the international efforts to overcome, to address a lot of global challenges, and part of global challenges are coming from veto power actually. So how come you guys are asking for veto power? That's his question. And a question from students. African countries want to have 2 seats with veto power in the Security Council. How are you going to fill these 2 seats? Is it going to be rotational? Are you going to designate some names? How are you going to come up with two names? And the last question from the lady was about African diversity. Africa is a very diverse continent. So how are African countries are doing in terms of overcoming diversity? So I would ask the 2 distinguished speakers. You can address all of the questions, or you can just choose and answer some questions.
Well, thank you very much. Let me start with the last question, and then I will take the ambassador and the students' questions together. My understanding of your question was that how do we engage with the practical realities of implementing African solutions to African problems in view of the diversity of the continent itself? That's a very simple question, because every society in this world, the Korean society, Africa, is not a homogeneous continent. It's a diverse and complex continent. But irrespective of, and of course drawing from the regional perspective of the continent itself, every society, they have their own traditional indigenous systems and mechanisms of addressing conflict, building peace, resolving wars, local disputes in their own societies. And these are time-tested societal resources, cultural agencies utilized to address these problems relating to peace, security, development, and governance. Every society in Korea, they have. So it's not a problem in Africa at all. In fact, the OAU, at the time of its transition to the African Union, the late president or prime minister of Ethiopia was very keen on making sure that how do we in Africa utilize our time-tested traditional resources, cultural agencies, societal institutions, and use it to resolve conflict, manage conflict, resolve conflict, build a peace, and reconcile bitterly divided communities. So it has been there. It is just a recognition, because during the colonial period and in the post-colonial period, especially with the explosion of wars and armed conflict, liberal peace-building intervention was prescribed as the panacea for Africa. It completely neglected African traditional approaches to building peace and resolving conflicts. The liberal peace intervention was premised on the following. One, you go in with preponderant military force, you put the warring factions together, you sign peace agreement, ceasefire, peace agreement, and hope it will hold. The second aspect is you democratize, you impose elections, democratization within the time frame. The third aspect is constitutional reform, constitutionalism. The fourth aspect is marketization, opened up the economies, etc. But we have realized in all of this society, it doesn't work at all, because the liberal peace-building intervention, in fact, that is the focus of my book, When War Ends, what is based on quick fix. You go in with a quick fix, all the usual package of intervention. You go in and impose it on an African conflict-torn society. Quick fix, short term, exit strategy oriented. You go in, do the usual top-down approach to liberal peace building and post-war reconstruction and state building, and then you get out. When it fails, they blame the country again, because you never address the fundamental issues. So that is why this approach to African solutions to African problems addresses the fundamental, the pre-war fundamental grievances that led to the wars in the first place. Liberal peace building never addressed that. But African solutions to African problems address that. That is why in Rwanda, after the civil war and the genocide, they started off by addressing transitional justice from a Western-centric perspective, retributive justice, taking those who are involved in genocide, taking them to the court system. But the court system could not cope with it. So they ended up with the gacaca system, which was restorative justice. And there's an African proverb which says, you cannot leave the court with your neighbor as friends. Because when you go to the court with your neighbor, the court will decide, you are right, I am wrong. We will never be at peace. But in the African restorative justice system, we try to reconcile and address the fundamental grievances and build the peace. So we come back as friends. So the traditional African approaches to peace building and post-war reconstruction has been predominant. Look at the case of Ethiopia. The recent conflict in Ethiopia, I can tell you for sure, the Western dimensions never wanted the conflict in Ethiopia to finish. I was sharing my perspective. The Westerners did not want the former president of Nigeria, President Obasanjo, to be the lead mediator because they said he's too African. I never knew that was a crime to be too African. African means he will not follow the Western interests. The Ethiopian government, Prime Minister Abiy and the Deputy Prime Minister, then I was special advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister on this issue, so I know the inside out of it. They said, no, we are not going to have any other Westerner. We are going to have President Obasanjo as our lead mediator. They resolved that conflict. It's finished. Based on African solutions to African problems. So that is why within the UN system in my presentation, they are now recognizing, the UN itself is recognizing African solutions to African problems, incorporating it into the operations of the UN peacekeeping and peace support operations. So it's always been there. On the question, the two questions raised, Ambassador, and the issue of what criteria you will use. The UN Security Council was a model established 78 years ago. The question you have to ask yourself, Ambassador, is it relevant today? Your position is that it has prevented large-scale Third World War. That's what you're saying. But has it prevented the devastating wars that we've seen across the globe? No, it has not at all. If anything, it has been used to orchestrate violent wars in different parts of the world, from Libya to Afghanistan to Iraq, Syria, etc., Africa. So you're blaming the veto. But it has been used by all parties to it. But let me tell you my experience as foreign minister. The Elzwini consensus is very clear, demanding for 2 permanent seats with veto power if it is retained. So it is not saying it must have a veto power. Africa is not saying by all means it must have a veto power. It is saying as part of this reform, if the veto power is retained, then Africa then must have it. Why should the United States and P5 members have it and Africa not have it? So that's the debate. But if you're saying if during the context of the reform, the veto power is removed because of all the problems it creates, then Africa will not have it. So that is the position. But let me tell you a new development. The United States, during the time going to the Security Council and as C10 coordinator, I acted a lot on behalf of the president of Sierra Leone. I engaged with the foreign ministers of all the P5 states. What I realized in those negotiations, they were keen to give Africa one seat without the veto. What the United States has done in August, it announced this year that it is prepared to give Africa one seat without the veto. But that is not even the issue. The United States also announced two other policies. They said they would now give a new seat, elected seat in the non-permanent category to small states, making it to 11. But equally enough, that we should now move to text-based negotiation. And that is serious. For me, that decision to move to text-based negotiation is even more serious than even the one seat without veto given to Africa. Why? America is playing politics. There is no consensus on the text that has to be negotiated. So why do you want to go to text-based negotiation? But it's playing to the G4 position. The G4 position is the one shared by Japan, Brazil, India, and Germany. China is dead against the G4 because of Japan. And we know the politics, the geopolitics around that. So why do we have convergence documents? We have not agreed on the outcome of the document. So why is America at this stage announcing that we should move to text-based negotiation? What text are we? It's still in its draft form. It's still being discussed. So how are you going to negotiate a document that has not been? And China, in my time as foreign minister, China spends a lot of money to prevent the C10 member states from taking the position. Now is not the time to go to text-based negotiation. The Americans have turned it around to say, now let's move on to text-based negotiation. So that is the politics of it all. The veto is unhelpful for everybody. But if it's retained, then Africa must have it. But if it's not retained, then Africa should not have it. On the issue of rotation, I think also one of the questions raised, the criteria. If we go on to the reform with 2 permanent seats and 5 elected seats in the non-permanent category, it's interesting. The C10 coordinator in almost all the heads of states that I met together with the president of Sierra Leone, the one question they will ask, especially the big 5 countries in Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Egypt, South Africa, and countries like Morocco and Kenya, the question they always ask is, who is going to be on that seat in the Security Council? Who is going to be given that seat? That's what the big countries are interested in. So I made a proposal to the president that when we met the other heads of state, we just say it has to be, our priority is to get the seats first with veto or not veto. When we get it, then the African Union can decide. If it's 2 seats, it can be a rotational strategy so that everybody benefits. But that is a problem. We can use the EU Council presidency within 6 months, rotational basis within 6 months. So it gives more and more opportunity for African member states to take part as permanent members. So 1 would be rotational among small and middle-income countries, and then 1 among the dominant 5 member states, the stronger states. That's the criteria, and it seems to have gone down well. So that is for the issue. But now let me turn briefly to the issues raised what does Africa expect of South Korea? I think I raised this in my presentation yesterday. The question that we should be asking is that, why is South Korea important to Africa? And I made the point that African leaders see in South Korea an alternative development pathway that is very attractive, in the sense that South Korea shares some of the challenges faced by Africa: wars, colonialism, military dictatorship, liberal democracy that is now being challenged, etc. But it's a mature democracy, so it will weather the storm. It will go through this challenge as well. It's a mature democracy. It will go through. So Africa sees in South Korea a mirror image of what they can achieve, and in particular, the spectacular economic growth rate that has been achieved within 60 years is very attractive to African leaders. So that is one. But it raises the fundamental question over and beyond this attractive model. Why will African leaders and African countries change their relationship with China, Russia, and the EU and settle for South Korea? What will South Korea give Africa? Bearing in mind, an international division of labor and international division of power is about resource accumulation and resource sharing. Is South Korea able to do the same kind of infrastructural diplomacy largesse as is being done by China? I don't think so. South Korea may have a GDP of $1.8 trillion, but it's never compared to the infrastructural diplomacy largesse and resources given by China to African countries. The same for Russia. So in the scheme of things, international relations and bilateral relations between states is really transactional. What is it that I want? States, I always say, are like individuals. We are all self-interested characters, just like states. So if South Korea is able to step up to deliver something that China and Russia and EU cannot do, then African states will gravitate to it, given this attractive model. This is the niche that South Korea can. What is also important is South Korea has a particular niche. South Korea's development has been predicated on human capital development, based development transformation. That is a specialism. That is the niche that South Korea must be able to share with the rest of Africa. In Sierra Leone, for example, we have focused on human capital development because we realize that despite the abundant strategic mineral resources in Sierra Leone, it has not provided progressive development in Sierra Leone. So now we are focusing on human capital development. But we don't have the expertise. That's where we are turning to South Korea. And the majority of African countries are looking to South Korea to learn from how come South Korea is not resource endowed, but is today a developed economy. That's the challenge. So that brings me to the question about the focus on the emergence of President Trump and Africa's perspective on this. Again, I would want to disappoint you. My understanding of international politics is not as clear-cut. I think we are making too much of Trump. We are making too much about Trump's second coming and how that will upset multilateralism. Even during his first term, yes, Trump, by definition, his politics is one of obstruction. But the obstruction is a calculated madness. There is method in that obstruction, and that obstruction is to achieve its strategic national interest for America based on transactionalism. He knows if he comes to NATO and tells them, if you don't pay up, we are not going to support you. He threatens to leave NATO. Most of the NATO member states will be scared, especially in Europe, so they will want to put in the money. So he achieves, by using threats to obstruct, he achieves the strategic national interest of reducing the financial burden of NATO on America. It's a strategic. That's how it has always been. So his second coming is going to be very much modeled on that one. African leaders, we've seen that. I have seen him in his room during his term, then as I was then Prime Minister. How he talks, I get a sense, as an academic, I can read that he's much interested in what he can get. As long as you understand that, then you can actually move towards that direction. Most African leaders and African countries are not even bothered about Trump's second coming because they see him as a man they can do business with. He is not going to begin to orchestrate wars and conflicts in Africa in any way. So I will be very much concerned that we do not exaggerate second Trump's coming, that it will upset multilateralism to the disadvantage of Africa. I think I'll leave you other questions. I've covered enough. Well, thank you very much. Thank
you. I think you have covered virtually everything. But let me just make some additional points. You know, every time we talk about African diversity, we tend to think of, you know, diversity meaning supremely divided. But that's not true. The whole basis of African social formation is that, you know, diversity is the foundation for cohesion, complementarity. The point is, you know, it's not a sameness Africa. It's an Africa that, you know, is diverse, but has room for accommodating differences, tolerating those things, and saying we can push all of that diversity to great capital, can become very positive, you know, for all the things we are doing. So when you hear African solutions to African problems, we're not saying there will be only one solution. I mean, these things, it's a bespoke thing. These are highly contextualized, you know, points about conflicts. All conflicts are not the same. They come in different characters and they have different manifestations. You know, but if you deal with conflicts following the principle of subsidiarity, to deal with a problem at its point of occurrence, or to address problems at the point where they occur, or use platforms and levels of governance closest to those points of, you know, problems, then you find that there's a plurality, you know, to African solutions. So African solutions is not simply, you know, that there's a one-size-fits-all, you know, strategy that is African. You know, if that's what we're looking for, we'll never get it. Because, you know, these things are contextualized and, you know, we have quite a variety, you know, of solutions. Now, how do you deal with the UN and these other platforms that are extra UN multilateral platforms? It's again complementarity. Now, let's put it this way. The UN recently organized the Summit of the Future. Now, this is an acknowledgement on the part of the UN, you know, that it needs to change. And it's simply saying, you know, how do you think we should change? And you know, people have canvassed positions. You know, people have made representations. You know, a lot of memoranda have been submitted and so on. Meaning, you know, how do we address a multilateral global order, you know, that has these different layers, you know? The first question is, why have these layers become necessary? Why do we need G7? Why do we need G77? Why do we need BRICS Plus? Why do we even need the AU? It is because it is impossible to have a multilateral architecture that is able to respond to all of these problems, you know, in an equitable and just manner. So we'll continue to need all of these groups. Now take the BRICS Plus, for instance, and the kinds of economic trajectories it is trying to build. That we should de-dollarize, for instance. Many countries have, foreign exchange problems. Their economies just cannot move at all. So if the BRICS Plus offers an alternative, then that's a useful way to go. Or, the AIDS regime, yesterday we were talking about the ODA and, the kinds of principles that are used for aid and so on. Now, what Africa needs is not charity aid, not humanitarian aid, but aid, that addresses specific problems, that are fundamental, to the development of the continent. Now, so when you talk, for instance, about why the Korean experience is attractive, that is why. Yeah, because it addresses important pillars of democracy in terms of not just infrastructural diplomacy, but those sectors that deal with the human resource, and that's what the minister has said. So I see that Africa does not see any contradiction at all, in the coexistence of these different platforms. If anything, they actually, make the multilateral system more robust. In fact, so robust that it is possible for everyone to find multiple uses of whatever platforms there are. It offers options and alternatives. And, for many countries in the world, for many societies, those are the things that you search for. It's, there's no one size fits all. You must do those things that, those other bodies offer. Expectations of South Korea. Now, he has talked about it. Expectations are built on the attraction of a model that has worked. But yesterday I was talking about this saying in South Africa, small is lekker, small is beautiful. What Korea, can do in Africa is not to simply reproduce or try to do the same things that everyone else has done. That, I think, is a mistaken model, for the simple reason that you cannot deal with all of those problems in one fell swoop. There are priority areas that you need to address. Why is China attractive for many African countries? It is because China is targeting those aspects of the economy that are very fundamental to regeneration and to growth. So people can see, for instance, that if you build roads, you build railway lines, you build airports, you're helping to build schools and so on, you're dealing with critical issues. Now, one of the critical problems in many African countries is the high rate of out-of-school children, for instance. You're dealing with issues of access to the basics, water, electricity, and so on. So all of the things that can be done in this regard, because we have seen that in Korea, the evidence is very strong that Korea has confronted these problems and dealt with them. But most of all, we think, and this is a personal opinion that I expressed yesterday, the point is about technology transfer, that is fully integrated. There's a backward integration that goes into it. It's not, transferring in the model of import substitution industrialization, but a growth transfer that is also, homegrown. So you can put those things there. In Nigeria, for instance, we have many Korean companies that are doing very well. But there's a component of doing very well that, Nigerians will want to see more, i.e., that there is actual integration of Korean technology, into the Nigerian soil. That way, you're different. What people are looking for, and this is the final point that I'll make, when you look at the aid, diplomacy, now the conditionalities that are attached to the aid that you get, make them not so very attractive. Now, so the Chinese have looked at it and they say, we can give you unconditional aid, okay? And the response from the West is to say, well, that's very tolerant, it's indulgent, it's all of those things that you would say. But what works? What works? And, there's respect. And I like the point that was made about, you don't take Africa for granted. Africa might have, its problems, but Africa deserves some respect also. And I think that, when we have those fundamental points about mutuality and respect and dignity that allows for choices to be made by Africans themselves, I think those things will help. So as we concluded yesterday, it is that Korea now has the advantage of learning from the other models that have been applied and therefore can see where they have worked or not worked and tweak those things to make the Korean partnership with Africa different. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think thanks to all the distinguished speakers, we can leave with a great deal of lessons and insights on Africa and Africa's relation with Korea. Thank you, everyone.